See the things I go through just for all of you. Okay, everyone, here we go. Thank you for your patience. Once I figure out if I can find my old videos, I'll know whether I need to do this every time or I can use the old videos. I don't want to waste your time every week. All right, we're gonna get started with the blood. I'm excited till 7:20. We got a little cartoon for you. So what this allows me to do is record the lecture. So for those of you that like to have a recorded lecture, some people like to go back and hear me again. That's what I'm doing. Okay. All right, so this is going to be a several chapter unit. So we start with the cardiovascular chapter unit. Our first chapter is the blood. Then we have the heart, and then we have blood vessels. So we've got 3 chapters in this first unit. Okay, so that's why I was saying we jump right in. So be ready. So this first chapter is on the blood. Here we go. Now, as a whole, we know the functions of the cardiovascular or circulatory system. As a whole, we know that. What I want to focus on in this chapter is the functions of the blood. For those of you that have not had me before, there's going to be some times where I say, you know, I kind of went past that screen. So that means don't worry about it for now. So I'll be sure I do my best to try and point out what you need to know and what you don't. So like I just passed that screen for now, don't worry about it. Instead, we're going to focus on these functions. Okay. I mean, really. Okay, I love this unit. Are you excited about the heart? It's kind of cool. Heart and blood. Yeah. I mean, it is amazing. We really just have a mechanical pump connected to a series of pipes. Really, in its basic form, that's what it is. But it is the life force of so many other things. Obviously, you probably know the blood is there for transport, right? The blood is our way to allow us to transport everything needed to our cells. What do our cells need in order to function? What is it that we're transporting to our cells? Oxygen, what else? Nutrients such as? A micronutrient. We have electrolytes like potassium and sodium. What other nutrients? Glucose. Someone said oxygen, amino acids. What else are we sending to the, what else is in blood that is delivered to the cells? Hormones, neurotransmitters, enzymes, platelets, everything. Not only are we transporting things to the cells, isn't the blood also responsible for transporting things from the cells back to the heart? Like waste products that the body's going to have to get rid of somehow? What sort of things get transported back towards the heart? Carbon dioxide, what else? This one's harder. What else do we transport back to the heart to send somewhere else for disposal? Carbon dioxide, we send to the lungs, we breathe out. What else? Okay, what kind of stuff goes to the kidneys? Urea, right? So urea is a breakdown product of nitrogen from amino acids. We're going to send creatinine, not so much creatine, but creatinine, which is a muscle breakdown product. I'm going to talk about these specifics later. I'm just trying to get your brain going. We send back to the heart from the cells damaged tissue sometimes that we need to get rid of. Okay. But the blood doesn't just do transportation. The blood has to be a certain pH, right? We got to keep the blood a certain pH, which we already established, 7.35, 7.45. So we really work hard to keep the blood the proper pH so it can transport all these things. Because these things that we're transporting, some of them are sensitive. If the pH is too acidic, it will denature the enzymes and they will break down, they won't work. The blood can also help us regulate ion concentration, potassium, sodium. The blood helps us with blood clotting. What is the component of blood most responsible for blood clotting? Platelets. Platelets? You guys are on the ball. If I could dance well, I would, but I cannot. I own it. One year I wanted to be like Ellen. You know, Ellen walks in her show, she dances. It was a massive fail. It was really bad. It was bad. The blood also contains things that help our immune system. What part of the blood helps our immune system? Like the white blood cells, among other things. And the blood also plays a role in maintaining body temperature. Can't we shift blood flow to help temperature change? Yes. When blood flow is pulled to an area, the temperature gets warmer. If you are outside and you're on the verge of being hypothermic, won't the blood supply come to the center as a way to keep your vital organs warm? Because in that condition, who cares about your pinky? We got to make sure these are working. So make sure you are familiar with all of these functions. Can you hear me okay through the mask? I typically have no problem projecting. All right, we are going to talk about the components of blood, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. But that's not good enough. Because there are also some really important properties. I would like you to know the general volume of blood in an adult. So on average, an adult has somewhere between 4 to 6 liters of blood. If it's a smaller adult woman, for example, maybe more like 4 liters. A taller adult, bigger adult, might be more closer to 6 liters. To give you an idea of what that is, I've got pictures of 2-liter soda bottles or seltzer bottles. So it will be 2.5 of those, 2 to 3 of those. Is that a lot, do you think, or not a lot? Is that more or less than you thought? It's kind of a lot, but when you think about the miles and miles of blood vessels that we have, it becomes a little bit less. You don't need to know the percent of body weight. You don't need to know the temperature, but I would like you to know the pH. See how I did that there? I pointed out what's most important. And then, my friends, you will see every so often there'll be a little blurb in the bottom because I don't want you to forget. That means not going to be a test question necessarily, okay? It's I get it from my mom. She was very good at needling, you know how parents or people can like needle you? Don't forget about that. Yes. Yeah. Who can remind us of the 4 main types of tissue? What type of tissue is blood? Connective, right? You notice that, didn't you?
Yes.
You can't forget that. Don't you love this one, the tonicity? Yes, my friend. By the way, as I'm going through, if you have questions, feel free to ask. So for those of you that have not had me before, don't hesitate to raise your hand. Don't be shy. You can also ask me after. Here's some important properties you should know about viscosity. What is viscosity? Thickness. So an easier way to know what viscosity is it's just thickness. Is the blood more viscous than water? Yes. The blood is more viscous than water. The blood is thicker than water because it contains a bunch of stuff, right? Yes, the bloodstream has a lot of water, the plasma, but it also has red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, plasma proteins, whatever. However, if the blood becomes too viscous, that could be bad, right? If the blood becomes too viscous, can you give a scenario when the blood would become too viscous, too thick? Say that again? Dehydration? Okay, so let's just think of some examples when the viscosity of blood is too high. Dehydration. So when I'm writing something on the board, you probably want to make note of it. You know, the exams that we have will be multiple choice. A lot of it in the exams is just recall, but sometimes I throw in more of an application question, such as this. So in dehydration, the amount of blood cells probably stays the same. The amount of cells may stay the same, but there's less of the plasma. So the result is a thicker blood. What if we have like a blood clot situation? When else might the blood become too viscous? An infection. Okay, maybe in an infection because you have more white blood cells, condition of leukocytosis. Some medications might make the blood too thick. Okay. If you're a diabetic, you might have more blood glucose, which would make the blood a bit thicker. You are all thinking on the correct path. Why is this so bad? That's the big one. So why this is bad is because it does decrease flow. So it will make the blood flow harder. But ultimately, where it's going to actually create a problem is it usually we say it increases the heart workload. So instead of the heart having to pump a certain intensity, instead of the heart having to pump a certain force, now it's got to pump harder just to deliver the same amount of flow.
So that would show up in a higher blood pressure rate.
Maybe.
No.
It depends on, because it's like a cause and effect. So it depends on the situation. If someone is dehydrated, they will actually have a lower blood pressure because, simply put, they have less fluid volume. So if I've been working outside all day in a hot sun and I've sweated out a lot of fluid, I'm dehydrated. Instead of having 4 liters of blood, I have 3.5 liters of blood. It's going to lower the blood pressure. But other cases, over time, it increases the workload of the heart. And over time, if the heart is having to work harder just to pump the same amount out, the heart starts to break down. What are some scenarios when the blood may become too thin? When might the blood become too thin? Okay, so we might purposely put someone on a blood thinner because they're prone to blood clots. Maybe after surgery, we know that they're going to have a lot of healing happening, a lot of platelet activity. We put them on a blood thinner. definitely not as common, right? This is more common. But I'm just trying to get you to think. What's that? Okay, when when they hold on to fluid.
Yeah, but I was thinking like, if they're just given.
Oh, yes. Okay, so if they're given a whole lot of fluid, that's true. Technically, maybe something like anemia. Just trying to get you thinking, right? If you have fewer red blood cells than normal. Just trying to get you thinking. This is definitely more common, and if the blood is too thick, it really makes the heart work harder.
Put like down kind of flow.
A lower blood flow. So if the blood is too thick, not as much blood flows through.
Okay. Oh, so just making sure.
I'm gonna start a new, let's see. For these two, all right. So I want to talk about osmolarity, and there's a bunch of ways you can define it. So these first two bullets, these are proper definitions of osmolarities, but I'm going to give you maybe something simpler. So I'm going to open up a new thing here. So the way that I think, let me use black. The way that I think it's easiest to talk about osmolarity, we talked about this in A&P1. Osmolarity, the concentration of the solute. Does that sound familiar? Or do you see the word osmolarity and you want to run? You don't want to run? Aren't you excited that this semester, the end of the semester, it's going to be sunny and warm?
Yes, they-
Instead of cold and dark.
well, we hope.
We hope. I just hope the winter doesn't, like if it's gonna snow, snow now. I don't want it to snow in April. Yeah, I don't. See, in Maryland, where I grew up, in March, it's a little warmer. Not
No,
here.
no. That into these.
So we may recall that in every solution, there's a solute and a solvent. Tell me about what is usually the solvent?
Water.
Usually the solvent is water. And the solvent is what is present in the highest amounts. So I like to give the example of Kool-Aid. In Kool-Aid, we have the solute and the solvent. In Kool-Aid, the solute is the sugar powder. Yeah. And the solvent is the water. The solvent is the solvent because it's what there's more of. It's what things dissolve in. The solute is what's present in smaller amounts. Right? So in Kool-Aid, the example of what the solute is would be the powder, the sugar powder. So therefore, osmolarity is the concentration of the solute. What would a high osmolarity Kool-Aid taste like? Very sugary and sweet. So if I'm thinking about a high osmolarity Kool-Aid, high osmolarity means it has a lot of solute. If I have a lot of sugar, it's going to taste sweet. What would a low osmolarity Kool-Aid taste like? Watery. Low osmolarity means there's less solute. It would taste watery. But I could also change the osmolarity by changing the amount of water. Technically, if I had Kool-Aid and I kept the same amount of sugar, but I removed water, technically, if I had Kool-Aid and I kept the same amount of sugar, but I took out water, what happens to the osmolarity? If I keep the same amount of sugar, but I take out water, the relative concentration of the solute goes up. It would taste sweeter, wouldn't it? So it's a relative concentration of the solute, not necessarily the amount, the concentration. Does that make sense? So I talk about this because I want to talk about the blood. Do you think the blood, in a normal situation, does the blood have a relatively high osmolarity or a relatively low osmolarity? This is a good question, isn't it? Just in general. I mean, it's good to see that my skills are still there. It's confidence, not arrogance. But I'll be the first to admit when I made a mistake, and I will make a mistake. So if we look at the bloodstream, right? What are the components of the blood? We obviously have water, yeah? What else do we have in blood? We have red blood cells, we have white blood cells, we have platelets, we have oxygen,
That's like a combination of some of those things.
we have CO2, hold that thought. We have some amino acids. Typically, the bloodstream is 45% plasma. Plasma is 95% water. So to answer your question, Angel, plasma is almost all water. And then 55% solutes, everything else, right? I'll just say cells, etc. So based on this, would you say the blood compared to say Kool-Aid? Hold on. Compared to say Kool-Aid, would the blood have a relatively high osmolarity or a low osmolarity? It's pretty high. It's osmolarity is the concentration of the solute. What are the solutes in blood? Right? So I have these backwards, don't I? Yeah. Yes, I do. So see, I was talking about me being confident. Look, I made a mistake already. I just get so excited. But I'm human. Is that what your hand was up for? Okay. I have those backwards. I'm sorry. The cells will be the solute. 45%.
So the platelets as well.
Yeah,
Under that
cells,
category.
platelets. They would all be considered solutes, everything except for the water. My point is, the blood in a healthy condition has a relatively high osmolarity. Can you imagine if Kool-Aid had this osmolarity? Can you imagine if Kool-Aid was 45% sugar? It would be, it'd be like chunky, wouldn't it? It'd be like sludge. It is really gross. So what I want to drive home is the blood has a relatively high osmolarity, and that's okay. Because we have to deliver so many good things. So it's okay. But it can become too high in osmolarity, couldn't it? So even though it's already relatively high in osmolarity, what are some scenarios when the osmolarity of blood might go up? Okay, so illness, infection. It's kind of pretty similar to the viscosity, isn't it? The osmolarity of blood will increase if we have more white blood cells. the osmolarity of the blood will increase when we're dehydrated. So the blood has a relatively high osmolarity because we want to be able to deliver a lot of good stuff. And that's okay, but it is possible for it to have too high of an osmolarity or too low for that matter. Okay. This is a little reminder here. We talked about osmolarity in terms of how it may affect the shape of cells. The only thing I want to remind you from A&P 1, normal saline solution is what to our bloodstream?
Isotonic.
Isotonic. Yay, see? Okay, I know we're winding down here, and that's okay, but I want to just introduce what we're going to talk about next. So the next part of this chapter is straightforward. Okay, so starting on Thursday, we're just going to go through the components of the blood. Once I corrected the percentages, we know that blood is 55% plasma, 45% everything else that we tend to call formed elements. You need to know those percentages, okay? 55% plasma, 45% formed elements. I want to make use of all of our time, so let me just begin discussing the plasma. So as we know, plasma is 55% of the entire blood. The biggest thing about plasma, it is the transport medium. So it is the liquid portion of the blood that enables us to transport all the cells and all the goodies. I'm going to skip ahead for a minute. Plasma is over 90% water. I'm not going to ask you that exact number, but just know that plasma is mostly water. Whether it's 92% water, 95% water, whatever. Plasma is almost all water. However, a small percentage of plasma is what we call plasma proteins. So suffice to say, plasma is mostly water with a very small amount of what we call plasma proteins. About 7% or so. These plasma proteins are not big in number, but they're really important. This is the last slide we'll do this evening. These plasma proteins are small in number, but they're really important. They're different from other proteins. So we'll talk about some other proteins that might be in the blood. There are some, for example, there may be some free-floating amino acids. There might be some complement proteins, part of the immune system. So there's other proteins in the blood. What we're talking about here are plasma proteins, a specific type of protein in the plasma. The most abundant plasma protein is something called albumins. Maybe you've heard of albumin before. It's a plasma or blood protein, plasma protein. I'm gonna circle one important function, and that's the only function you need to know. One of the primary functions of albumin would be fluid balance. You don't need to know the exact percentage of albumins, but I would like you to know that the albumins are the most abundant. So out of all of the plasma proteins, there are the most albumins. And they play a role in fluid balance. We have some plasma proteins called globulins. They play a role with our immune system, antibodies. And there are some plasma proteins called fibrinogen, and they play a role in blood clotting. They're going to help us form fibrin, which is the main component of our blood clot. You could imagine on our first exam in a couple weeks, some matching the type of plasma protein with its function. You could imagine a question like, which plasma protein is most abundant? Easy, albumin. These are going to come up more later in the semester, but for now, just need to know that they're plasma proteins and their basic function. There's extra information down here that you don't need to know. If you're wondering how they stay in the blood, it's because they're too big to squeeze through the blood vessel wall. So they tend to be kind of larger, but you don't need to know those. All right, I'm going to end there. We'll pick up on Thursday. I'll see you in the lab, right? If you have any questions, feel free to come up. If you do have your signed contract, maybe you could just leave a pile at the end of the desk on that side.
Like the slide picture.
And welcome back. Yes. Who knows what TV show that's from? Don't say. Who knows what TV show this is from? You can't do that on television. Alanis Morissette was on that show. Come on. It's my job to educate you on the 80s and early 90s.